Antiochus IV Epiphanes was one of the most controversial rulers of the Seleucid Empire, which controlled large portions of the Near East following the fragmentation of Alexander the Great's conquests. He ruled from 175 to 164 BCE, inheriting a kingdom that stretched from Asia Minor to the borders of India. His reign was marked by ambition, reform, and relentless attempts to consolidate power in a politically unstable empire. Born around 215 BCE, Antiochus was the son of Antiochus III the Great, a powerful ruler who had expanded Seleucid territory through wars and diplomacy. After his father's defeat by the Romans, the young Antiochus was sent to Rome as a political hostage under the terms of a peace treaty. His years in Rome exposed him to Hellenistic culture, Roman political strategy, and the practices of centralized governance that would later influence his rule. When his brother Seleucus IV Philopator was assassinated, Antiochus returned from exile and seized power with the help of the Pergamene king, Eumenes II. His accession was not uncontested, but he quickly established himself as the legitimate monarch through calculated alliances and displays of authority. The title he adopted, Epiphanes, meaning God manifest, reflected his self-image as a divine ruler chosen to embody Greek civilization. Antiochus IV sought to strengthen the Seleucid state by promoting Hellenization across his empire. He encouraged the spread of Greek language, customs, architecture, and religion, often imposing them upon local populations. Temples dedicated to Greek gods were built in cities under his control, and athletic games were organized to symbolize cultural unity under Hellenic ideals. These measures, while intended to unify the empire, alienated many of the traditional and religious communities under his rule. His policies were particularly controversial in Judea, where the Jewish population maintained deep religious traditions that resisted foreign influence. Antiochus viewed the persistence of these customs as a challenge to his authority and the broader Hellenistic order. He believed that loyalty to the state required cultural conformity, and that opposition to Greek customs equated to rebellion. Economically, Antiochus IV inherited a weakened treasury due to his father's heavy indemnities owed to Rome. To restore financial stability, he implemented strict taxation policies and appropriated wealth from temples and local elites. This increased revenue temporarily stabilized the Seleucid finances, but caused widespread resentment among his subjects, particularly those who saw temple seizures as acts of sacrilege. Militarily, Antiochus demonstrated competence and ambition. He launched campaigns in the east to secure territories that had drifted from Seleucid control. His expeditions into Armenia and Persia reinforced his image as a strong ruler, restoring the former glory of his dynasty. Yet his attention soon turned westward, where Egypt presented both opportunity and challenge. In 170 BCE, Antiochus invaded Egypt under the pretext of protecting his nephew, the young Ptolemy VI Philometor, from internal court intrigues. The campaign initially succeeded, and he managed to occupy parts of Egypt, including Memphis and Alexandria. However, the intervention of Rome forced him to withdraw, marking a political setback that revealed the limits of his power against the rising influence of the Roman Republic. Despite this, Antiochus maintained his confidence and continued his efforts to centralize authority. He introduced reforms to improve military efficiency, reorganizing the army to reflect both Macedonian traditions and newer Hellenistic innovations. His emphasis on loyalty and discipline was intended to prevent internal uprisings and ensure swift responses to any threats. In cultural policy, Antiochus's reign was notable for grand architectural projects that demonstrated wealth and power. He sponsored the construction and renovation of temples, theaters, and gymnasiums across the empire, particularly in Antioch, his capital. These projects symbolized his vision of a unified Hellenistic civilization under divine kingship. However, this same vision created growing tensions in regions where local traditions conflicted with his ideals. Nowhere was this more evident than in Jerusalem, where the introduction of Greek practices, such as the establishment of a gymnasium and the promotion of pagan worship, caused internal divisions among the Jewish population. Some elites supported Hellenization for political advantage, while others viewed it as betrayal. Antiochus's insistence on religious conformity was rooted in his belief that unity of worship would ensure stability of rule. To him, the worship of Greek gods was not merely a matter of faith, but a statement of loyalty to the state. This ideology clashed directly with the monotheistic beliefs of the Jews, whose laws forbade idolatry and demanded strict adherence to their covenantal traditions. By the mid-160s BCE, reports of unrest in Judea reached Antiochus's court. He perceived these disturbances as acts of defiance, not mere religious disputes. His subsequent actions would be shaped by a conviction that suppressing dissent was essential for maintaining imperial order. This approach reflected both his authoritarian temperament and the broader Hellenistic notion of divine kingship. Diplomatically, Antiochus maintained relationships with neighboring kingdoms through calculated gestures of generosity and intimidation. He offered gifts to Greek cities and patronized temples dedicated to the Olympian gods, presenting himself as a benefactor of Greek culture. Yet behind this image of cultural patronage lay an intolerance toward those who refused to conform. His contemporaries described him as both visionary and erratic. Ancient historians such as Polybius and Livy portrayed him as a ruler who combined intelligence with impulsiveness. His actions could shift rapidly between generosity and cruelty, depending on circumstance. To his supporters, he was a restorer of Greek civilization. To his enemies, he was a despot who demanded obedience through fear. The empire under Antiochus IV was vast and diverse, encompassing peoples with different languages, religions, and customs. Managing such an entity required careful balance, yet Antiochus's policies often prioritized ideological control over pragmatic governance. His enforcement of Greek norms deepened divisions rather than resolving them. By emphasizing his divine status, Antiochus alienated many traditional power structures, including local priesthoods and regional governors. His assertion that the king represented the will of the gods left little room for compromise. As resistance grew in different parts of his empire, particularly among the Jews, his response would take on increasingly severe and punitive forms. The reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes thus marked a turning point in Seleucid history. It reflected both the zenith of Hellenistic ambition and the fragility of an empire bound together by force rather than consensus. His determination to impose unity through culture and faith would soon give rise to some of the most brutal measures of the ancient world. In the years following his consolidation of power, Antiochus's policies shifted from integration to suppression. The belief that disobedience equaled treason drove his administration toward harsh enforcement of decrees. The stage was set for acts of persecution that would become infamous in history, remembered not for political reform, but for the fires that consumed those who refused to renounce their faith. By the time Antiochus IV Epiphanes turned his full attention to Judea, tensions between Greek authority and Jewish resistance had already reached a breaking point. His campaign to impose Hellenistic customs upon the Jewish people was not initially designed as an extermination effort, but as an assertion of imperial unity. However, his rigid enforcement and the defiance it provoked soon transformed political reform into religious persecution. In 167 BCE, Antiochus issued a series of decrees that outlawed traditional Jewish practices. The reading of the Torah, the observance of the Sabbath, and the practice of circumcision were all declared illegal under penalty of death. The Jerusalem Temple, once the center of Jewish worship, was converted into a sanctuary for Zeus Olympios. Pagan sacrifices were introduced, and Greek priests were appointed to oversee the rituals. These acts were not only administrative reforms, but deliberate attempts to erase a distinct religious identity. The enforcement of these laws was carried out with precision. Soldiers were stationed across Judea to ensure compliance, and local officials were tasked with identifying those who resisted. Altars to Greek gods were erected in towns and villages, and the inhabitants were compelled to make offerings of swine flesh, an act deeply offensive to Jewish law. Failure to comply was treated as rebellion, punishable by death, through methods designed to instill fear. Reports from ancient sources describe instances where entire families were executed for refusing to abandon their traditions. Mothers who circumcised their infants were put to death, their children killed alongside them. Elderly scribes who secretly taught the law were tortured and executed in public as examples of what defiance would bring. Antiochus considered these measures essential to break what he saw as religious obstinacy that threatened the cohesion of his empire. Among the punishments ordered by Antiochus, one of the most notorious was death by fire. Those accused of defying royal decrees were burned alive in furnaces, a method chosen both for its visibility and its association with ritual purification. The furnace became a symbol of royal authority, a tool through which the king sought to purify his subjects of rebellion and enforce loyalty to the gods of Greece. The origins of this practice were not unique to the Seleucid court. Burning as a form of execution had existed in several ancient cultures, often reserved for acts considered sacrilegious or treasonous. Under Antiochus, however, it became a systematic instrument of terror. Large furnaces, similar to those used for metalworking and pottery, were repurposed for public executions. Victims were bound and thrown into the flames, their deaths witnessed by soldiers and civilians alike. The policy served dual purposes: punishment and deterrence. Public burnings were staged in city squares and temple courtyards, ensuring that resistance would be met with visible retribution. Officials recorded the names of those executed, sending reports back to the royal administration to demonstrate their efficiency in maintaining order. Each act of violence reinforced the king's image as the enforcer of divine will and imperial unity. The most notable instance of furnace executions occurred in Jerusalem, where groups of Jewish rebels and religious leaders were captured following the desecration of the temple. According to accounts preserved in later writings, these captives were offered the chance to renounce their faith and worship the Greek gods. When they refused, they were led to furnaces built outside the city walls and executed by fire. Their ashes were left unburied as a warning to others. Antiochus viewed such executions as acts of state necessity rather than cruelty. He considered himself a restorer of order, eradicating superstition and disobedience. The ideological framework of his reign held that resistance to Hellenism was resistance to civilization itself. Thus, the punishment of rebels was presented as both a political duty and a religious offering to the gods. Within his administration, not all officials agreed with the extremity of his policies. Some Greek governors in peripheral regions expressed concern that the repression would provoke long-term instability. Yet Antiochus dismissed such warnings, arguing that fear was the most effective means of ensuring compliance. His correspondence with local authorities emphasized the need for immediate and visible enforcement of decrees without hesitation or compromise. The practice of furnace execution also carried symbolic weight within Hellenistic thought. Fire was associated with divine purification and transformation. To Antiochus and his advisors, burning dissenters was an act that purified the empire of impurity. In their interpretation, the flames consumed rebellion and restored harmony between the human and the divine. This ideological justification masked the brutality of the act under the language of order and enlightenment. Archaeological and historical records suggest that furnace punishments were concentrated in areas of high resistance, particularly in Jerusalem, Samaria, and parts of Galilee. The victims included priests, scholars, and ordinary citizens who refused to abandon their customs. The number of those executed is unknown, but the recurrence of fire-related punishments in multiple sources indicates that it was a significant element of Antiochus's policy of suppression. The use of fire as punishment was not only intended to eliminate opposition, but also to humiliate the victims. Their deaths were often accompanied by public mockery, with soldiers forcing them to bow to idols before execution. The destruction of sacred texts and the burning of scrolls added another layer of symbolism, representing the erasure of both body and belief. Antiochus's officials justified the severity of these actions through royal proclamations that framed them as necessary for peace. The decrees emphasized that disunity and superstition endangered the prosperity of the empire. By eradicating religious nonconformity, the king claimed to be restoring divine favor to his realm. This rhetoric allowed acts of cruelty to be presented as administrative reforms rather than persecution. The psychological impact of these punishments was profound. The sight of furnaces burning in city squares instilled terror in the population. Yet instead of extinguishing resistance, the repression strengthened it among segments of the Jewish population. Underground gatherings continued, and groups of rebels began to organize armed resistance, later known as the Maccabean Revolt. Antiochus remained unaware that his efforts to enforce conformity were creating the very rebellion he sought to prevent. His officials continued to report successful executions, interpreting temporary quiet as compliance rather than simmering resentment. The empire appeared stable on the surface, but beneath it lay growing defiance. The furnace, intended as a tool of submission, became a symbol of martyrdom among the oppressed. Stories of those who faced death without renouncing their beliefs began to circulate secretly among the Jewish people. These accounts portrayed the victims not as criminals, but as faithful individuals who had chosen death over apostasy. As the fires of Antiochus's furnaces burned across Judea, they did more than destroy human life. They deepened divisions between ruler and subject, transforming cultural policy into religious war. The same flames that were meant to purify the empire instead ignited a resistance that would challenge Seleucid authority and redefine the boundaries between faith and power. The policy of forced Hellenization and execution by fire did not achieve the unity Antiochus IV Epiphanes envisioned. Instead, it accelerated the collapse of Seleucid authority in Judea. The brutality of the furnace executions, carried out in towns and cities across the region, provoked widespread outrage and inspired organized resistance. What had begun as isolated defiance soon transformed into open rebellion. In 167 BCE, a rural priest named Mattathias and his sons initiated what became known as the Maccabean Revolt. Their uprising began in the small town of Modin, when Mattathias refused to offer sacrifice to the Greek gods. His public act of defiance triggered a movement that spread rapidly through Judea. Peasants, scholars, and former soldiers joined the revolt, motivated as much by faith as by resentment towards Seleucid oppression. Antiochus underestimated the scale of this resistance. Believing it to be a minor provincial disturbance, he dispatched small military detachments to suppress the rebels. These forces met unexpected resistance and suffered repeated defeats. The Jewish fighters, familiar with the terrain and driven by conviction, used guerrilla tactics to disrupt Seleucid control. As reports of rebellion multiplied, Antiochus's perception of Judea shifted from a disobedient province to a symbol of defiance threatening imperial stability. In response, the king ordered harsher crackdowns. Cities suspected of harboring rebels were attacked, and more public executions were staged. The furnaces continued to burn, consuming both the guilty and the innocent. Yet each act of punishment only fueled the insurgency. For every rebel executed, more rose to take their place. Antiochus's reliance on terror as a governing strategy had reached its limits. Beyond Judea, the strain on the Seleucid Empire was becoming evident. Continuous wars, heavy taxation, and internal power struggles weakened the administrative structure. Antiochus's attention was divided between suppressing revolt and maintaining dominance in the eastern provinces. His resources were stretched thin, and the once powerful empire began to show signs of fragmentation. While Antiochus waged campaigns in Persia to secure financial resources, the Maccabean forces captured key strongholds in Judea. They cleansed the Jerusalem temple of Greek idols and restored Jewish worship, reversing one of the king's most symbolic decrees. The event became a defining moment in Jewish history, later commemorated in the festival of Hanukkah. When news of these developments reached Antiochus, his health was already deteriorating. Ancient sources suggest that he suffered a sudden and severe illness during his campaign in the east. Accounts vary, but many describe a physical and mental breakdown marked by delirium and pain. Though interpretations differ, his decline symbolized the moral and political decay of his reign. By the time of his death in 164 BCE, the empire he had sought to unify through force was fractured. The furnaces of Antiochus, intended to cleanse disobedience, had instead left a legacy of defiance and remembrance. His reign was remembered not for his cultural achievements or military campaigns, but for the persecution that defined it. The fire he kindled in the name of order became the flame that illuminated the enduring power of faith against tyranny.